My name is Alex, though lately even that feels like a half-truth. I grew up in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where every front yard seemed curated to signal normalcy, and every neighbor had a story about who you were supposed to be before you even opened your mouth. I was the middle child, sandwiched between an older sister who never seemed fazed by the world and a younger brother who still demanded attention like it was owed to him. I learned early that blending in, being the good son, the irreliable sibling, was safer than standing out, and for a long time, I wore that invisibility like a uniform. School was a regimented rhythm of predictable roles. I was neither the star athlete nor the class clown. I was the observer, the one who took mental notes and rarely acted on them. I liked details, small patterns of color, the way sunlight hit the corner of a classroom window, the slight tremor in someone's voice when they were lying. But I had never thought to look closely at myself in the same way. Identity, in my understanding, was something you inherited, a collection of expectations, habits, and labels handed down without consultation. That perspective began to crack in subtle ways around the time I turned 16. It wasn't dramatic, no lightning bolt of revelation or earth-shattering moment, but an accumulation of small, quiet dissonances. I found myself drawn to fabrics, textures, and shapes that my clothes, my uniform of conformity, didn't offer. I would linger in the clothing section of stores, pretending to look at gifts or casual wear, but secretly studying skirts, blouses, and soft sweaters. It wasn't about attention. It wasn't even about desire in any simple sense. It was curiosity, yes, but also a deep, unspoken recognition, something inside me was waiting to be seen. At home, my family's energy was a complicated mix of affection, expectation, and quiet oversight. My sister, ever self-assured, noticed more than she let on, but she never commented directly. My younger brother was oblivious, blissfully, irritatingly so. My parents were careful. Their love was constant, but it carried the weight of assumption that their children would fit the molds they understood. I began to realize that transformation, if it were to happen, wouldn't be a private act alone, it would ripple across our family, through every look, word, and shared silence. The first time I actually dressed in clothes that were not mine by accident or necessity, it was a Sunday morning. My sister had left for a friend's house, and the apartment smelled faintly of her perfume, which lingered on her bedroom door. I hesitated outside the doorway as if stepping over the threshold were a moral test. Inside, neatly folded on the chair, were a soft cardigan and a skirt in muted tones I had always admired from a distance. My fingers brushed the fabric and the warmth of the cotton was startling, intimate, almost electric. I remember thinking, what happens if I try this on? What happens if I let myself feel it fully, without apology? It wasn't instant revelation or freedom. I felt awkward, almost like trespassing in my own body. My reflection seemed foreign. The face staring back at me had the same eyes, the same set of cheekbones, but the outline of who I thought I was, blurred around the edges. There was fear, yes, but also a quiet thrill, a hint of something I couldn't yet name. I spent hours standing in front of the mirror, turning slowly, noticing subtleties, the way my posture shifted, the way light interacted with the fabric, the way my own perception of myself began to stretch, twist, and expand in ways I hadn't known were possible. Over the following weeks, I began keeping notes, not to document a secret life, but to map the emotional terrain I was navigating. I wrote about joy tinged with guilt, confidence tinged with doubt, and the strange empathy that grew for anyone whose outward appearance didn't align neatly with their inner self. I noticed how public spaces could feel simultaneously threatening and liberating, the cautious awareness of others' judgment, the tiny victories in a glance that acknowledged me without questioning, the silent solidarity of someone who seemed to understand without words. What I didn't anticipate was how moral reflection would entwine with this process. Wearing these clothes, exploring this side of myself, wasn't just about identity, it was about accountability. Every choice, from the mundane to the profound, had consequences, for the people I loved, for the relationships I wanted to nurture, and for the version of myself I wanted to cultivate. I had to balance honesty with sensitivity, curiosity with compassion, self-discovery with responsibility. The transformation I was experiencing was as much ethical as it was personal. And so the days stretched, each one a quiet negotiation between who I had been and who I was becoming. I learned that identity is never fixed, it is a living conversation, one that takes place both inside and outside, between the self and the world. Some mornings I would wake with exhilaration, others with fear. Some nights I would write until the ink ran dry, trying to capture the subtleties of the shifts I felt, the internal dialogues that left me both exhausted and elated. In those pages, I began to understand something vital: transformation is not a spectacle. It is a series of moments, small and profound, that teach empathy, responsibility, and courage, even when no one else is watching. And in that realization, I finally heard it, the quiet voice inside, no longer hesitant, saying that this journey, uncertain, complex, and morally alive, was mine to navigate. I didn't know the destination. I didn't know the trials or the surprises ahead. But I knew, in that fragile, thrilling awareness, that stepping forward was not only inevitable, it was necessary. The days after that first experiment with my sister's clothes felt like walking on a tightrope. Every movement, every glance, seemed magnified, though nothing outwardly had changed. I began noticing things I had never paid attention to: the subtle way a neighbor would tilt her head in the hallway, the quiet judgment or curiosity in classmates' eyes when I smiled, the almost imperceptible way my parents' voices shifted in tone when I asked a question about something as mundane as laundry detergent. I realized then that transformation wasn't just personal, it existed in relation to everyone around me, whether I consciously sought it or not. School became a minefield of perception. I hadn't altered my appearance drastically in public yet. Mostly, it was small details: the way I held my hands, the angle of my shoulders, the fabrics peeking under my uniform. But I felt the scrutiny as a physical weight, pressing against my ribs, making me second-guess even simple interactions. Some classmates noticed a difference in my posture or expression, though few commented outright. And in those moments of silence, I learned to observe, really observe, the social choreography I had taken for granted: how certain expressions could communicate confidence or hesitation, how a tilt of the head or a shift in stance could change someone's assumptions entirely. At home, the atmosphere was more nuanced than I had anticipated. My parents didn't confront me, their silence was a quiet, living judgment. Yet I could sense subtle shifts: my mother lingering longer in the kitchen while I brushed past, my father's offhand comments tinged with unintended meanings. I realized early on that honesty with oneself carries obligations toward others. The more I explored my identity, the more I had to consider their perspectives, their expectations, and their fears. It wasn't about suppression, exactly, it was about cultivating empathy, understanding that my self-discovery could unsettle people I loved. My sister, on the other hand, was both a mirror and a guide. She never lectured me or demanded explanations, she simply noticed, and sometimes, that was more powerful than words. One afternoon, she found me in my room, draped in a cardigan over my shoulders, scribbling in my journal with a trembling hand. She didn't comment at first. She simply leaned against the doorframe, watching, waiting. Finally, she said, "You're trying, huh?" And that was enough: not praise, not judgment, just recognition. It struck me then that part of transformation is learning to accept acknowledgement without needing validation or fear of condemnation. I began to experiment more intentionally. Not just with clothing, but with mannerisms, speech patterns, and the internal scripts I ran through my mind. I noticed how certain tones made me feel authentic, while others made me shrink back, apologizing silently to a world that had not asked for my permission to notice me. Each day, each small choice, became an exercise in moral and social awareness. I had to navigate the tension between my own comfort and the reactions of others, between experimentation and responsibility. That balance was delicate. It required reflection, observation, and sometimes painful restraint. Journaling became my lifeline. I documented not only what I wore or how I moved, but how each experience felt in layers: physical, emotional, ethical, relational. I wrote about the thrill of discovering a texture I loved, the discomfort of being seen in a way that felt vulnerable, the guilt of realizing my choices might confuse or worry someone I cared about. The pages became a map of internal terrain, a chart of moral and emotional topography I hadn't realized existed. Through this practice, I began to understand that identity exploration is inseparable from empathy. The more deeply I understood myself, the more acutely I perceived the impact of my actions on others. There were moments of extraordinary clarity. Walking home one evening, the air crisp and cool, I noticed the interplay of light and shadow on the sidewalk. A classmate waved, and I waved back, feeling the subtle shift in my posture and the unexpected confidence that radiated from a decision to inhabit my body fully in that instant. I felt seen, but not in the way I had feared, simply acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, I sensed a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Transformation is less about external change and more about aligning the inner self with lived expression, step by deliberate step. But there were setbacks, too. The internal conflict could be relentless. Some mornings, I dreaded the mirror, fearing that my reflection would reject me or that the world would. The anxiety of potential judgment weighed heavily. At night, I wrestled with questions about honesty, morality, and responsibility. How much should I reveal? How should I navigate the social expectations pressing in from all sides? These questions weren't rhetorical, they were practical, lived dilemmas. Each decision carried weight, shaping not only my self-perception but the relationships that anchored me. The emotional journey wasn't linear. There were days of exhilaration, when a new combination of clothing, posture, and expression felt effortlessly right, as if I were touching a hidden resonance of self I hadn't known existed. There were days of despair, when the simplest glance or remark threatened to unravel my tentative confidence, leaving me questioning everything. And in those highs and lows, I discovered an unexpected discipline: patience. Transformation is not a climax but a continuum, a slow unfolding that demands observation, reflection, and compassion for oneself and for others. I began to notice subtle shifts in my own moral compass. The act of presenting differently, of exploring identity, revealed new dimensions of integrity I hadn't considered. Every interaction became a test of honesty and empathy, to act authentically without exploiting others' perceptions, to seek understanding without imposing, to navigate curiosity without causing harm. These lessons were not abstract, they were lived, internalized through trial, reflection, and careful attention. In learning to inhabit my own identity, I was learning, simultaneously, how to inhabit the ethical world responsibly. And yet, there was still fear. Not the dramatic fear of discovery or confrontation, but a quiet, pervasive tension, the question of whether I could sustain this evolving self in a world that often prefers static labels and simple truths. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew I might never fully reconcile the internal and external, the personal and relational. But the act of trying, of inhabiting my own experience, of reflecting and observing, was itself transformative. Each day, each choice, each moment of recognition or doubt became a thread in the fabric of a self I was learning to understand, respect, and gradually, to trust. In the quiet of my room, late at night, I would look at the clothes folded neatly on my chair and feel both anticipation and apprehension. I understood that transformation was more than what one wore or how one was seen. It was a dialogue with oneself, a moral and emotional negotiation with the world, and a tender, sometimes difficult process of building empathy and understanding. Every reflection in the mirror, every thought scribbled in my journal, every cautious interaction with my family and peers was a piece of that ongoing conversation, a conversation I had only just begun to comprehend. And somewhere in that awareness, I found a fragile clarity, that the journey ahead would be uncertain, demanding, and often uncomfortable, but that it was also necessary. The path of exploration, empathy, and responsibility had no final destination, only the continuous practice of honesty, self-reflection, and connection with others. And in that knowledge, I felt the first real stirrings of courage, not the reckless courage of bravado, but the quiet, moral courage to inhabit myself fully, and to do so with integrity. I began to notice, with a strange mixture of fascination and anxiety, how every ordinary space seemed subtly transformed by my perception. Hallways that had once felt neutral now carried a kind of moral weight, each glance from a classmate or family member charged with potential meaning. I became hyper-aware of how people positioned themselves in relation to me, how voices shifted unconsciously when I spoke, and how even silence could feel like a judgment or a conversation in itself. These were not revelations of cruelty or malice, rather, they were reminders that social perception is layered and intricate, and that every act of self-expression carries ripples beyond the self. The first real test came during a small family gathering in our living room. I had decided, after weeks of private experimentation, to wear one of my sister's softer cardigans over a blouse I had chosen, paired with a skirt in muted earth tones. I didn't expect anyone to comment. My sister was away, my younger brother distracted with video games, and my parents usually observed quietly rather than interject. But as I entered the room, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle tightening of attention. My mother's hands paused over the teapot, my father's gaze lingered a moment too long before he looked away. I realized, with a sinking sense of gravity, that the act of simply being myself in a visible way had consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. That evening became a study in moral reflection. I could sense my parents' discomfort, not as overt criticism but as a quiet, questioning energy that asked me to navigate both honesty and empathy. I sat down with them later, trying to articulate what I had felt, how these clothes, these subtle changes, were not about performance or attention, but about exploring a part of myself that had long been silenced. My mother listened with careful patience, her eyes a mixture of concern and curiosity. My father remained quiet for longer, but in the pauses, I sensed the weight of expectations, of love intertwined with fear for the unknown. It struck me then that identity is never only personal, it is relational. Every choice carries ethical significance because it affects the people around you. I realized that exploring oneself requires negotiation, not surrender, not hiding, but also not assuming that self-expression exists in a vacuum. I began to understand that true transformation is inseparable from responsibility toward oneself, yes, but also toward those whose lives intersect with yours. The realization was both empowering and daunting, and I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest. At school, the experience unfolded differently. I had not yet made my presentation fully public, but subtle cues, the angle of my posture, the softness of my gestures, the way I allowed my voice to find tones I had previously suppressed, began to shift the way others perceived me. Some classmates noticed and whispered, others merely registered a slight difference without naming it. I learned quickly that social awareness is as much about observing responses as managing them. Every interaction became a calibration, a negotiation between authenticity and prudence. I had to decide when to reveal, when to temper, and when to simply exist without explanation. Friendships became a crucible of self-reflection. A close friend, Jordan, noticed changes immediately. One afternoon, leaning against the lockers, he asked, "Are you experimenting?" I paused, uncertain whether honesty or evasion would serve better. Then I chose honesty, not complete revelation, but enough to convey that this was a personal exploration, a process I was navigating carefully. Jordan's reaction was not dramatic, not judgmental, but thoughtful. He nodded, and we continued talking, the conversation layered with mutual respect and cautious curiosity. That moment reinforced a lesson I was beginning to internalize: authenticity is not reckless, it is measured, attentive, and informed by awareness of context and consequence. I began to document these experiences in increasingly detailed journal entries. I wrote about the subtle dynamics in conversations, the weight of ethical responsibility, the interplay of internal desire and external perception. I recorded every moment of tension, every flicker of relief, every instance where empathy guided or restrained me. My journal became a living map of moral and emotional terrain, helping me trace the contours of identity, responsibility, and social awareness. In writing, I discovered a rhythm of reflection, a way to inhabit my evolving self while remaining conscious of the world I shared with others. Sleep, too, became a mirror of internal struggle. I found myself dreaming in fragments of possibility and anxiety. I dreamt of walking through hallways where the walls shifted according to perception, where classmates and family members alternated between recognition and indifference. I dreamt of conversations in which words I could not find in waking life emerged effortlessly in sleep. And I woke with a heightened awareness that transformation is not merely external or performative, it is psychological, ethical, and deeply relational. Every internal adjustment, every moral calibration, rippled outward, influencing thought, behavior, and connection. At home, the tension between personal exploration and familial responsibility grew more pronounced. I became attentive to subtle cues, the way my mother's eyes lingered when I entered a room, the way my father's voice carried a tentative edge, the quiet but precise attentiveness of my younger brother. I realized that ethical self-expression is not a solitary act, it is embedded in the lives of others. Each decision required thought, whether to wear a particular outfit, how to phrase a personal truth, when to push the boundaries of curiosity, when to step back. I began to see these choices as exercises in empathy, not constraints. Transformation, I learned, requires moral attention as much as self-discovery. One particularly vivid moment came late one evening, as I was sitting at my desk, journal open, lamp casting a narrow pool of light. I had just returned from a brief outing, an experiment in public presentation, subtle, careful, nothing extreme, but enough to feel the edges of self-consciousness. I wrote, I am learning that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to engage fear with thoughtfulness and integrity. In that moment, I understood something I had not yet articulated fully. The journey of transformation is inseparable from the cultivation of ethical discernment, the practice of empathy, and the conscious negotiation of relationships. This process, I realized, would be ongoing. There would be moments of clarity and exhilaration, yes, but also moments of doubt, tension, and relational friction. Each step forward would be informed by reflection, observation, and accountability. I began to see that identity exploration is not a linear path toward a fixed destination. It is a dynamic, evolving process, a series of choices and recalibrations that shape the self and the world it inhabits. By this point, I had also begun to notice an unexpected internal dialogue, one part of me urging caution, another curiosity insisting on exploration, a third quietly meditating on ethical responsibility. I understood that these voices were not contradictions, but companions in the journey, a complex moral chorus that guided, cautioned, and encouraged me in equal measure. I began to value their input, realizing that self-understanding requires listening not just to desire, but to conscience, empathy, and reflection. I had begun to inhabit a different rhythm of daily life, morning reflections, careful attention to clothing, posture, and voice, journal entries mapping moral and emotional terrain, quiet observations of social interactions, and nighttime contemplation of internal shifts. It was exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying, and illuminating all at once. Transformation, I realized, is not a matter of external appearance alone. It is a profound engagement with the self, others, and the ethical dimensions of existence. And in those long, reflective hours, I began to glimpse a deeper truth, that identity is never static, and transformation is never purely personal. Each choice I made, each experiment, each subtle shift in presentation, was intertwined with relationships, social perception, and moral accountability. Every step forward was a negotiation between authenticity and empathy, curiosity and responsibility. And in that ongoing negotiation, I discovered a fragile, profound sense of clarity, that to explore oneself fully is to cultivate awareness, integrity, and connection, and that those qualities are the foundation of any meaningful transformation. It was during the early days of autumn that I first felt the full weight of visibility pressing against me, an almost tactile awareness that who I was becoming could no longer remain entirely private. The leaves outside my window were turning, a cascade of amber, ochre, and russet, and the ordinary world seemed infused with a subtle intensity, as though nature itself acknowledged the internal shifts I was navigating. That morning, I had chosen a combination of clothing that felt safer than previous experiments, soft, muted, neutral tones, but even this modest presentation seemed enough to trigger a cascade of self-awareness. I left my apartment cautiously, each step measured, each glance outwardly casual but inwardly meticulous. Walking past neighbors, I could feel the intricate social calculus of observation, a nod here, a brief smile there, a slight hesitation in someone's stride that carried meaning I might or might not correctly interpret. It was exhausting, this constant attention to nuance, and yet it was enlightening. I realized that part of transformation is developing a keen sensitivity to the world, not for manipulation, but for understanding. Each interaction became a study in perception, each glance a lesson in empathy. At school, the effects of visibility were more pronounced. Some classmates whispered, some stared, some said nothing but reacted with subtle body language, posture shifts, slight tilts of the head, raised eyebrows. I learned to read these signals not as judgment alone, but as complex responses to a reality that challenged expectations. The process demanded patience, patience with myself, patience with others, and the moral discernment to choose when and how to engage. It was becoming clear that identity is relational, and that social perception is as much a part of transformation as self-perception. One afternoon, my closest friend, Jordan, approached me in the library. His expression was measured, neither amused nor judgmental, but charged with curiosity. Alex, he said quietly, you've changed. I don't just mean your clothes. I nodded, aware that what I was about to say would carry weight. I know, I admitted. I'm trying to understand myself better. I want to do it honestly, carefully. Jordan's gaze softened. I get that. I just want to be sure you're safe. Safety, both physical and emotional, had become an undercurrent in everything I did. My experimentation was not reckless, but it demanded constant reflection on consequences, ethical and social. Home was a different crucible. My parents' silence was no longer neutral, it was layered, multifaceted, a blend of curiosity, concern, and tentative acceptance. I became acutely aware of the moral and emotional dimensions of my presence in our shared space. Even mundane interactions carried moral weight, which words to choose, which gestures to make, how to inhabit my evolving identity without imposing fear or discomfort on those I loved. I realized that the ethical responsibility of transformation is continuous, not episodic. Each choice ripples outward, shaping perception and relationships in ways often unseen but profoundly felt. It was my sister, however, who provided both reflection and challenge. She noticed subtleties in my mannerisms, voice, and posture that others missed, and she did not shy away from probing. Are you okay with this? She asked one evening, as we prepared dinner together. I hesitated. I realized I was not just exploring identity, I was also confronting internal contradictions, insecurities, and fears. I think so, I replied, but it's complicated. Some days feel right, some days, confusing. She nodded thoughtfully. Just make sure it's you doing it, not just curiosity or pressure. Her words struck me, the journey of transformation is not merely external or performative, but fundamentally a negotiation with one's inner world. Authenticity demands attention, reflection, and courage. School continued to be a layered challenge. Classrooms became arenas of subtle negotiation. A glance here, a comment there, a laugh misinterpreted or rightly noted, it all became part of an intricate dance of self-awareness. I began noticing patterns in social perception, the way certain tones of voice invited attention, the way subtle gestures could signal confidence or vulnerability, the way physical presentation intersected with moral responsibility. Each day was a lesson in observation, empathy, and reflection. I realized that true transformation requires not only self-awareness but relational intelligence, the ability to navigate social landscapes thoughtfully and ethically. One particular incident crystallized this lesson. During a group project, a classmate, unaware of the subtleties I had cultivated, made a teasing remark about my appearance. My first impulse was defensive, reactive, but I paused. I reflected on my desire to inhabit my identity honestly and the importance of responding without escalating conflict. I replied calmly, honestly, and without sarcasm, explaining that I was exploring aspects of myself and asking for respect in return. The moment was tense, but it resolved with a quiet acknowledgement from my peers. The incident reinforced a critical insight: transformation involves courage not only in self-presentation but in moral action, asserting authenticity while maintaining integrity and empathy. At home, reflection deepened further. I began journaling not only experiences but motivations, ethical considerations, and relational dynamics. I explored questions such as, why do I feel compelled to present differently? How do my actions affect others' perceptions and comfort? What boundaries should I maintain for myself and others? Writing became a practice of moral clarity as much as self-discovery, a disciplined exploration of the intertwined nature of identity and responsibility. Each entry was a meditation, a small map of the psychological, ethical, and social terrain I was navigating. The emotional stakes grew as I experimented further. I started to explore nuances of posture, gesture, and vocal modulation. Each subtle adjustment elicited internal reflection: how authentic is this? Does this honor who I am or merely mimic who I want to be? Perceived as? The process demanded patience, observation, and self-compassion. I realized that transformation is iterative. It unfolds slowly, requiring repeated experimentation, reflection, and recalibration. There are no instant solutions, only incremental understanding and moral awareness. Family dynamics became increasingly complex. My parents' reactions remained largely quiet but perceptible, a hesitation in conversation, a careful choice of words, a subtle softening or tension in tone. I became acutely aware of the interplay between my self-exploration and their perceptions. It was no longer sufficient to inhabit my own identity privately, I had to navigate relational ethics, balancing authenticity with sensitivity, curiosity with accountability. I discovered that the moral dimension of transformation is continuous and relational, it is lived in daily decisions, interactions, and reflections. Peer interactions continued to sharpen these insights. Some friends were curious but cautious, others indifferent, and a few subtly challenged my evolving presentation. I noticed that empathy, both giving and receiving, became central to every encounter. Understanding others' perspectives, anticipating responses, and calibrating my own behavior were not restrictions, they were exercises in moral and social intelligence, essential to sustaining authenticity in a world unaccustomed to nuance. Sleep became an arena of psychological processing. Dreams reflected tensions I had not fully acknowledged in waking life, scenarios in which my identity was questioned, misunderstood, or celebrated. In dreams, I confronted both fears and aspirations, and I woke with a deeper awareness of the ethical and emotional dimensions of transformation. My journal became a repository for these reflections, a space to interrogate internal contradictions and to chart the interplay between personal exploration and relational responsibility. I began to understand that transformation is not a linear journey from one state to another but a complex interplay of perception, ethics, and self-understanding. Each day presented new challenges and opportunities, moments of exhilaration and affirmation, moments of fear and doubt, moments of ethical reflection and social negotiation. I learned that identity is relational, moral, and psychological, and that the act of inhabiting one's evolving self requires sustained attention, empathy, and courage. By the end of that autumn, I had begun to feel a subtle but profound shift. My reflection in the mirror no longer elicited the same dissonance, my posture, voice, and gestures were attuned to my emerging identity. Social interactions, though still complex, had become arenas for reflection, ethical calibration, and empathy. And though uncertainty remained, I felt a fragile confidence, the courage to inhabit myself fully, ethically, and attentively, in a world that would always challenge, question, and occasionally misunderstand me. In those long, reflective evenings, I recognized a truth that had been forming slowly over months: transformation is not merely an act of clothing or appearance, but a profound engagement with one's inner world, one's ethical responsibilities, and the social realities that shape experience. Each subtle adjustment, each reflection, each conversation was a step in an ongoing, iterative process of self-understanding, empathy, and moral courage. And in that recognition, I felt the first stirrings of what would become a guiding principle, that living authentically is inseparable from living responsibly, thoughtfully, and attentively in relation to others. Winter came softly, almost imperceptibly, but its quiet presence seemed to amplify everything I was feeling. The streets were gray, the sky low, and the bare trees scraped the wind like skeletal reminders of impermanence. I had spent months carefully navigating my exploration of identity, experimenting with clothing, posture, voice, and the subtle ways I presented myself to the world. Each choice had been weighed, reflected upon, journaled. Yet with the colder months came a new kind of pressure, the realization that hiding less, being more visible, could no longer remain confined to private spaces or moments of fleeting curiosity. The first morning I decided to leave the apartment fully dressed in the clothes I had come to feel were my own, I felt a cocktail of fear, anticipation, and fragile pride. My reflection in the mirror was unfamiliar yet intimate. I recognized the eyes, the line of my jaw, but everything else, posture, gestures, the way my hands rested, the subtle tilt of my head, had shifted. I felt exposed and courageous in equal measure. I carried a deep awareness that every step outside was a negotiation, every glance from another person a subtle test of perception and empathy. The bus ride to school was the first real crucible. I felt every eye unconsciously measuring, every whispering tilt of the head carrying its own judgment. Some people were curious but respectful, others were dismissive or indifferent. Each reaction forced me to reflect, to recalibrate my own emotional response, to ask, how much do I let their perception define me? How much do I internalize what is projected? It was exhausting and illuminating in equal measure. I began to understand that public life is a dialogue, not a monologue. Identity exists in relation to others, and ethical awareness is as necessary as personal courage. At school, the tension escalated. My peers, classmates I had known for years, had to reconcile their previous assumptions about me with a new, emerging reality. Some approached with curiosity, some with care, and a few with subtle judgment. I had learned to navigate these interactions with patience, empathy, and honesty. I answered questions when asked, kept conversations grounded in reality rather than performance, and observed the emotional undercurrents in each interaction. These small acts became exercises in social intelligence and moral discernment. Identity, I realized, is inseparable from relational awareness. The act of inhabiting oneself fully requires understanding the ripple effects on those around you. Home remained a quiet arena of moral and emotional negotiation. My parents' reactions were still muted, but the subtle shifts were unmistakable: a softer tone in my mother's voice, a slight hesitation in my father's words, a careful attentiveness in the way my family accommodated my presence. I began to sense the depth of responsibility that transformation carries, not as restriction, but as ethical mindfulness. My choices were not isolated, they had consequences, sometimes invisible, sometimes profound. I had to inhabit my identity while honoring the comfort, expectations, and feelings of those I loved. The first confrontation came unexpectedly, one evening at the dinner table. My father, after a long pause, asked, "Alex, do you feel certain about these choices? About who you want to be?" It was not accusatory, but it was urgent, weighted with love, concern, and unspoken fears. I took a deep breath. I realized that honesty was my responsibility, not only to myself, but to him, to my mother, to my family as a whole. "I'm exploring who I am," I said slowly. "I don't have all the answers. But I want to do it carefully, thoughtfully, and honestly." There was silence. My mother's eyes glistened slightly, a mixture of recognition, concern, and tentative pride. My father nodded, slowly. "Then we'll support you," he said, "as long as you're thoughtful and responsible." That night, I felt the gravity of moral negotiation. Transformation requires not only courage, but relational integrity, the ability to navigate love, fear, and responsibility simultaneously. Friendships shifted, too. Some deepened, others frayed. Jordan remained a steady presence, his support steady but measured, guiding me through moments of uncertainty and self-doubt. But others could not reconcile my evolving presentation with their expectations, and distance formed. I realized that transformation is not just personal, it is a social act, a negotiation of relational truth and perception. Choosing authenticity can strain relationships, and maintaining empathy requires awareness, patience, and courage. Public life became a mirror of internal conflict. I noticed how small micro-expressions from strangers could elicit waves of anxiety or affirmation. Walking past someone who paused to study me, noticing a lingering look in the hallway, catching a subtle change in a teacher's tone, it all required reflection and recalibration. I had to distinguish between projection and reality, between fear and actual threat. Each encounter became a lesson in moral and social literacy, in empathy and self-possession. Winter deepened, and with it, my journal entries grew more detailed, more introspective. I documented not only external events, but the psychological ripples they caused, the thrill of recognition, the ache of misunderstanding, the ethical calculations of self-expression. I explored questions like, how do I navigate visibility responsibly? How do I honor my own curiosity while respecting the comfort and expectations of others? What does it mean to inhabit a self authentically in a world resistant to complexity? Writing became a method of processing, an ethical practice as much as a personal record. One afternoon, a particularly sharp confrontation at school crystallized these lessons. A group of classmates teased me for standing differently, for speaking with new intonations. My first impulse was panic, a desire to shrink back into invisibility. But I paused. I reflected on the values I had been cultivating: honesty, empathy, relational awareness. I responded with measured calm, explaining that I was exploring aspects of myself and asking for respect in return. The conversation ended without incident, but but the experience underscored a fundamental truth: transformation is inseparable from moral courage, the willingness to inhabit one's identity while maintaining integrity and respect for others. Even moments of solitude became intense arenas of reflection. Walking through the quiet streets at dusk, I noticed the way my shadow shifted, how the world's light fell across me differently than before. I reflected on the cumulative months of experimentation, reflection, and social negotiation. Transformation was no longer merely a private curiosity, it was an ongoing ethical, emotional, and social practice. Every gesture, every interaction, every reflection mattered. By the time midwinter arrived, I had developed a rhythm: mornings of reflection, days of careful social navigation, evenings of journaling and self-interrogation. I noticed a subtle resilience forming, a quiet confidence not born of ego, but of sustained moral attention, empathy, and practice. I realized that living authentically is not a single act, but a continuous process of calibration, balancing curiosity, courage, empathy, and responsibility in every interaction. And in those long, cold nights, I understood something profound: transformation is not a linear narrative of change from one identity to another, but an ongoing conversation with oneself, others, and the world. It requires patience, observation, ethical reflection, and the courage to navigate fear and uncertainty. Each small choice, the tilt of a shoulder, the cadence of a voice, the subtle curve of a gesture, becomes a moral and emotional statement, a claim to authenticity grounded in relational awareness. By the end of winter, I could look at my reflection with more clarity than ever before. I saw a self both familiar and evolving, a body and mind negotiating identity with integrity, courage, and empathy. I had learned that true transformation is as much about moral and social awareness as it is about self-expression, and that living authentically demands the continuous practice of attention, reflection, and responsibility. I realized that the journey would never end, that uncertainty and growth were constant companions, and that the courage to inhabit oneself fully is inseparable from the compassion, patience, and ethical discernment that make life meaningful. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in increments so small they were easy to miss: a longer stretch of daylight, the faint scent of damp earth after snowmelt, the gradual loosening of the world's grip. I noticed these changes because I had learned how to notice, how to pay attention not only to myself, but to subtle shifts everywhere. In many ways, that attentiveness had become the most lasting transformation of all. By then, I no longer thought of what I was experiencing as a phase or experiment. Nor did I feel the need to name it definitively. Labels had once seemed like destinations, promises of certainty. Now I understood them as tools, useful at times, limiting at others. What mattered more was how I lived, how I treated myself and others, and how honestly I engaged with the questions that continued to arise. I had grown into a steadier rhythm. Mornings no longer began with dread or exhilaration, but with a quiet sense of readiness. I dressed without ritual or anxiety, choosing what felt aligned rather than what felt safe or provocative. The mirror had lost its power to accuse or exalt me. It had become what mirrors were meant to be: reflective, neutral, honest. I no longer searched my face for permission to exist. At school, the intensity had softened. Familiarity does that, it blunts the sharp edges of difference. People adjusted. Some still watched me with curiosity, others with indifference, a few with genuine warmth. There were still moments of misunderstanding, still glances that lingered too long, but they no longer defined my internal landscape. I had learned something essential: being seen does not require being consumed by perception. One afternoon, walking home under budding trees, I realized I was no longer rehearsing conversations in my head. I was present. My shoulders were relaxed, my breath unguarded. I was not performing resilience, I was inhabiting it. That realization startled me more than any earlier fear had. It was quiet, unceremonious, and deeply grounding. My family, too, had changed, not in dramatic declarations, but in accumulated gestures. My mother asked my opinion while folding laundry, her tone unguarded. My father spoke to me with the same easy familiarity he used with my siblings. My sister teased me gently, no longer cautiously. The house had rebalanced itself around the truth of who I was becoming, not because everything was fully understood, but because it was acknowledged. One evening, my father sat beside me on the porch. The air was cool but forgiving. After a long pause, he said, "I don't pretend to understand everything. But I see you thinking carefully about who you are. That matters." I nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, I felt something settle, an unspoken agreement rooted not in certainty, but in mutual respect. I understood then that acceptance is often quieter than rejection, and far more enduring. What surprised me most was how this journey reshaped my empathy. I found myself noticing others more deeply, the classmate who avoided eye contact, the neighbor whose gestures always seemed tentative, the stranger on the bus holding themselves as if braced for impact. I understood, in a way I never had before, how many people are navigating invisible negotiations every day. Identity, I realized, is rarely about expression alone, it is about survival, dignity, and the desire to be met without distortion. I also became more accountable, to my words, my assumptions, my influence. Exploring myself had taught me that curiosity without care can harm, that authenticity without reflection can wound. I learned to ask better questions, to listen more carefully, to pause before responding. These were not lessons limited to gender or expression, they were lessons about being human in a shared world. There were still moments of uncertainty. There always would be. Some days, I felt anchored, others, fluid. Some questions remained unanswered. But the difference was this: uncertainty no longer frightened me. It no longer felt like failure. It felt like space, room to grow, to revise, to learn. Looking back, I can see how narrow my understanding once was, not just of myself, but of identity as a whole. I had believed that transformation required dramatic rupture, that understanding oneself meant arriving somewhere final. What I learned instead was that transformation is cumulative. It is built from attention, honesty, and the willingness to remain ethically awake. It is shaped by relationships, constrained and enriched by responsibility, and sustained by empathy. If this story has meaning beyond me, it is not because of what I wore or how I was seen. It is because of what the process taught me, that self-acceptance is not indulgence, but discipline, that empathy is not automatic, but practiced, that integrity is not a fixed trait, but a daily choice. I learned that identity is not something you claim once and defend forever, it is something you live into, carefully, with awareness of its impact. I am still becoming. That has not changed. What has changed is my relationship to that fact. I no longer rush toward answers or retreat from questions. I move forward with curiosity grounded in care, expression tempered by responsibility, and confidence shaped by reflection. And if there is one truth I carry with me now, it is this: understanding oneself is never separate from understanding others. The more honestly I inhabit my own experience, the more gently I hold space for those still finding their way. That, I believe, is the quiet, enduring work of transformation, and the reason this journey mattered at all.